Thank you for joining us for our conversation with author and therapist Phil Lane. My name is Nazla Rex. I'm the Adult Services Specialist here at Pennington Public Library. While everyone's settling in, I'd like to take a moment to recognize that May is Mental Health Awareness Month. We invite you to help normalize the conversation around psychological well-being and foster a community of care and compassion with this discussion. This program's designed for anyone who's seeking to deepen their knowledge and understanding of panic and or illness anxiety. So it's a very important conversation. And an important note about our conversation tonight, this program is for educational purposes only and is not intended as a replacement for psychological services. Now a little bit about our presenter. Phil Lane is a licensed clinical social worker. He is a psychotherapist, an adjunct professor, and author. He's written the following books: Understanding and Coping with Illness Anxiety. I have it right here. Overcoming Panic and Panic Attacks, as well as the Narrative Therapy Workbook for Self-Esteem. So Phil writes and practices from a humanistic, person-centered perspective. His private practice is located in Pennington. So he's a local guy here. Is very happy to have him. He lives here with his family, and I want to thank Phil for donating his time to his community for this important conversation. And lastly, before I turn it over to Phil, I want to let everyone know we are doing a book giveaway. So I'm going to put a link in the chat, and it's a very short form. So you will have a chance to own Phil's books. The two that I showed, the Overcoming Panic and Panic Attacks and Understanding and Coping with Illness Anxiety. So I hope everyone is game for that. We will contact you by email once we have chosen winners. So we welcome your questions in the Q&A, and please use the chat for comments. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Phil Lane. Phil, welcome.
Hey, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Fabulous. So tonight we're going to have a conversation about your work, about what you have put in your books, your perspective as a therapist. And I'm just happy that we can be together to have this discussion. So I think to start with, we're going to talk about the why behind your books. Phil, you've been a practicing therapist for quite some time. Was there a specific moment or perhaps a recurring conversation in your office that made you realize these insights needed to be in a book rather than just shared behind closed doors?
Well, I should give you a little backstory, which is that before I was a clinical social worker, my undergraduate degree was in English and writing. So writing, reading books, they've always been a part of my life. So I struggled with illness anxiety, what used to be known as hypochondria, but thank goodness we've changed that terminology. I struggled with that for quite a few years in my life. And at some point, I can't pinpoint exactly when, but I started to write about it. I started to just write things down. I was learning about it. I was doing my own sort of off-the-shelf research on it. And this started to take the form of, I guess, what started to become a book. It wasn't intention. That wasn't the intention. The intention was more to just have sort of my own library of information about this particular challenge that I had gone through. It ended up being sort of like a mini manuscript. The book itself is rather a slim volume. It's part of the publisher's Focus on Mental Health series, so I don't even think the book is 100 pages. But anyway, it ended up being a somewhat short manuscript, and I thought, well, let's see if anybody would be interested in publishing this. And I knew very little to nothing about the publishing process, but I did some research and started to put some proposals out there, and it hit an editor's desk, and she wrote back and said, I struggle with this, and I think that this would be a really great resource, so we'd like to publish it. So I not exaggerating when I say I sort of stumbled into why that first book became a book. Um, from there, I started to get some other opportunities to write and had some other publishers approach me. And another thing I struggled with were panic attacks. So when I had the opportunity to write a book about those, it was very important for me to be able to put some information about panic out there as well.
I mean, just in having gone through the books myself, I find that in their slim nature, that makes them very digestible. The way it's laid out, it's a very approachable. Um, you start out with the education of defining everything, and then going into some of the applicable methodologies and adding in case studies. So I do really appreciate your approach with having it be, as you said, a smaller manuscript.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And I think, and anybody who's gone through anxiety, I think can attest to the fact that anxiety is very, very overwhelming and confusing, and you need something accessible. You need accessible coping skills. The last thing a person who's struggling with anxiety wants to read is like a 400-page volume on anxiety. So I think in their brevity, they lend themselves well to being able to learn about these challenges and to learn skills for coping with these challenges.
Absolutely. They're great. So thank you. So moving on into some of the meat of the books, let's talk about defining the biology of a panic attack. In your work, you describe a panic attack not as a failure of the mind, but as a survival mechanism that's essentially misfired. Can you walk us through what is actually happening physically during those moments and why understanding the biology is often the first step towards managing it?
Absolutely. One of the ways I describe panic to clients is that it's a primitive response in a sophisticated world. We live in a very complex and sophisticated world. You know, we're surrounded by stimulus at all times, but we hold on to this, and we all have this sort of primitive, animalistic, mammalian, if you will, response to things that appear fearful. And in primitive times, the fear was pretty tangible. It would be, for instance, a wild beast that was chasing you down. But the fears we face now are more existential in nature. They can be more abstract. They're things like humiliation or failure. But our body still has that very, very primitive, simplistic response. And that's essentially what a panic attack is. We're responding in a very primitive way where our body and our nervous system is sort of taking over. Our heart's palpitating, we're lightheaded, we're dizzy, all those really uncomfortable feelings. The difference is that there is no wild beast. So, but I can't stress enough, that doesn't mean that we're neurotic. It just means that there's sort of a misalignment between the stimulus and the response.
Perfect. Thank you. So going from panic attacks to anxiety, illness anxiety, it can feel like an endless cycle of checking and worrying. So, for those in the community who find themselves stuck in a what if loop regarding their health, how do you suggest they begin to differentiate between um, a valid health concern and an anxiety-driven narrative?
Yeah, that is always the difficult part of illness anxiety because we can't ignore our health. You know, we do need to pay attention to it. But if we pay too much attention to it and we fixate, that's where we start to create narratives and create beliefs about what's happening in our own bodies. And I can tell you from my personal experience, that could be something like having a vague pain. And I just can't stop focusing on it. I can't stop paying attention to it. In fact, I'm paying so much attention to it that I'm starting to block out the other sensations of my body, and that one sensation is almost taking over. So Look, nobody can say that we should just avoid medical care. We need to get our yearly checkups. We need to do all those things. But we have to also be aware that not every physical sensation necessarily means that something larger is happening or something catastrophic is happening. We are prone, myself, having just turned 46, I mean, I'm prone to aches and pains like I've never had 10 or 20 years ago. I have to continue to remind myself these don't signal a larger medical problem or a larger medical catastrophe. Many of these don't require me to seek immediate medical care. So it's really about being able to acknowledge sensations within ourselves and within our bodies without having to respond to them in an emergent way.
Right. Do you have any suggestions for people when they are at that point when they are ready to say to themselves, this is what's happening and how to break it down?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing is to slow down. Anxiety moves incredibly, incredibly fast. It moves so quickly that we rarely have time to really stop and catch our breath, but we really need to do that. Our nervous system is really firing very quickly, and our cortisol, our naturally occurring stress hormone, is pumping through our veins. So it's really important that before we take action, we just slow down. And this is going to sound overly simplistic, but literally take a breath. Take a deep breath. A deep cleansing breath will slow down your nervous system. So, number one, slow down. You don't have to respond to every single physical sensation. And I'll share an anecdote. When I was really struggling with illness anxiety, I had gone to a cardiologist at one point, and the cardiologist became frustrated with me in the appointment. This is something I discuss in the book, by the way, bedside manner, and how it's not always ideal for those of us who are anxious. But the cardiologist said to me at one point, he said, "Listen, I can't explain to you what every single little feeling in your body is." And he was kind of like, I mean, he wasn't being very kind about it. He was, but I did understand the message, which was I was really fixating on every single thing I was feeling. I didn't care for his delivery. He could have delivered in a much more empathetic way. But I understood, what he was saying. Now, if I had been able to sort of slow myself down, I may never have gone to the cardiologist. I didn't need to. At the time, I thought I had to. I was misinterpreting my physical symptoms. The other thing I would recommend is not feeling alone with this. Concerns about our health are human. They're absolutely normal. Our health is fragile. We really can't predict what's going to happen health-wise down the road. So we don't have to carry this anxiety about our health alone. Loved ones are loved ones because they're not going to judge you. I've gone to my wife at times and said, I need you to talk me down a little bit because I'm really feeling this and I feel like, this means I'm having an aneurysm or something. And she's great about not being judgmental. She'll say, well, let's just sit and take a few minutes and she'll really talk some logic into me. So I think not carrying this alone is really, really important. We tend to look at anxiety through this old lens of neurosis. When you think about how illness anxiety was once known as hypochondria, and we all have associations with hypochondriac, it sounds manipulative. It sounds like we're being performative. Illness anxiety is a much more accurate way to describe that this is worry and anxiety we experience around our health. So normalization and being able to not carry this alone is really, really important.
I agree. I agree. Absolutely. Um, and maybe just going back to panic attacks for a moment, um, maybe it would be good to also sort of address, the physical sensations and maybe also another moment for people to address what's happening in that situation and what they can do.
The common physical sensations, and these are unique to the individual, but many of the sensations associated with panic that are commonly reported are heart palpitations or racing heart, chest tightness, that sort of thing. Respiratory stress or distress. So feeling short of breath, feeling like it's hard to catch your breath. Lightheadedness and dizziness are very common. Gastrointestinal discomfort is very common. So there are some commonly experienced sensations that go with panic. we can look at these as what's known in psychology as somatic mimics. If you think about that, what that implies is that these are somatic or physical sensations that are mimicking or copying more serious medical conditions. So that palpitating heart mimics what might happen during a heart attack, but it is not a heart attack. It's very important for us to understand that a panic attack cannot harm you. You cannot die from a panic attack. They're extremely, extremely uncomfortable, but they cannot actually cause you physical harm. In their most acute moments, they're going to last maybe 3 to 5 minutes. They will then subside, and you may be in discomfort for a time after that, but the most acute part has passed. But those are some of the physical sensations that you may experience if you go through panic. What's really important to remember is that because of the quickness of a panic attack, these sensations will pass. If you
Mhm.
simply sit and rest, if you drink some water, if you take some deep breaths, the symptoms will subside. It can be hard to believe that when you're in the throes of a panic attack. And that's why a lot of people who go through panic, myself included, may go to the emergency room. I have been to the emergency room more than once for what ended up being a panic attack, but it was because of a rush to response, if you will. So, again, that
Mhm.
idea of slowing ourselves down. If you have a trusted loved one who will sit with you and just kind of help you get through it, that's always really helpful. But that's what you can expect from a physical sense, and that's what you can do in order to not over respond to the uncomfortable physical sensations.
Thank you for explaining all that. That's very clear. Um, and so um, let's let's sort of bring it back to the books in that relation. And so when you're writing about these intense topics like panic and anxiety, how do you balance the clinical side of your brain and the empathetic side? How do you make sure the prose feels like a helping hand rather than textbook?
Yeah, what a great question. I really endeavored with these two books to write a book that I would have found helpful. Um, so I really kept in my mind that these are not meant to be clinical works. They can be used by clinicians. They certainly can be on a therapist's bookshelf, but really the intended readership is just the everyday person who may not be a therapist. I wanted them to be non-judgmental, to be empathetic, and to be helpful, but to also be practical. And so that's really what I aim to do in both books. At the end of the day, it can feel so isolating to go through these issues. So I think sometimes having a trusted voice can be very helpful. I also think that I'm uniquely qualified to write these books, having gone through these challenges. And I'm not saying that that's a requirement for anybody who writes a psychology book, but you know, it's like having some street cred. Like, I know what that panic attack feels like. I know what that illness anxiety is. I've been in that emergency room when the doctor says, "What are you doing here?" So I get that. And in both books, in the introduction, I write a little bit about that and how my own personal experience underlies a lot of the work. The clinical part is important because I'm a big believer in psychoeducation, understanding the psychology of what we experience. And I always tell people one of the biggest things that helped me really kind of recover from this persistent anxiety and panic was I started to learn a lot about it. I started to get really curious about it. Instead of saying, this kind of rules me, I said, well, let me find out about this. How does this work? I read all kinds of books on anxiety, panic, and it really helped me. It took some of the power of the problem away. So that's why I include clinical information as well, because I want the reader to be able to get a grasp, a knowledge about these issues, why they happen, how they happen, what we can do about them. So I think right along with normalization, psychoeducation is also a big part of healing.
Exactly. I mean, that's part of why we're hosting this at the library
Yeah.
specifically to bring these topics to the public, to a communal space, um, and talking about them, in a non-clinical setting. Um, can you speak a little bit more about the effectiveness of reducing shame and go along those lines?
Or, shame is something that we all experience, and it's when we feel that we're less than, or we're not able to handle something the way we're supposed to be able to handle it. And shame has all types of layers. And I'll tell you from a male perspective, there's a gendered part of shame. As a male, based on male narratives and norms, we're kind of told, suffer in silence. Like, don't go talk about this. It took me a long time to go to my own therapy, which people might find ironic. But it was late in my 20s that I finally said, I think I got to talk to somebody, and it was so helpful. Um, I had to get through that shame of this means I can't do it myself. Well, yeah, but that's okay. Nobody said I had to do it myself. So part of the release of shame is the commonality of the experience and the normalization of the experience. Shame is this belief that there's something wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with you for being anxious. We experience anxiety because the world is full of stimulus that would make any normal person anxious. So I think that we don't want shame or low self-esteem or feelings of failure to become obstacles to getting help that we need. And help doesn't just mean going to a therapist's office or taking medication, right? It might mean like connecting more with your loved ones. It might mean starting to do some self-care activities that you haven't been doing. But we can't let shame or feeling bad about ourselves become an obstacle to those things that can make our lives better.
Right. Do you want to talk a little bit about your workbook, um, the narrative therapy workbook for self-esteem? I thought that was, we also have that at the library, in what the process is and how that helps change, your personal perspective of
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah, for sure. Narrative therapy is this idea of the story we tell about ourselves, which is very apropos for a library program, right? It's about the narrative and the story, sort of the movie we watch about ourselves. And the point of the workbook is to help sort of rewrite that narrative, find the pieces of that narrative that we've been ignoring. We tend to latch on to a story about ourselves, and sometimes it's a problem story. For a long time, the story I attached to myself was I'm anxious. And that's really an all-encompassing narrative that leaves out a lot of nuance. And narrative therapy is something that I practice. It's something that I've done since very early in my career. Again, because of that natural connection to being a reader and a writer, it resonated with me right off the bat. So when I had the opportunity to write a book about it, I mean, I had to. And it's another book that is designed for the end user. It's designed for just the normal reader. It's not necessarily a book that's for a clinical readership, and it can help you to rewrite the story you tell about yourself, to find your strengths that have sort of been buried or that have been obscured by some of the challenges you face. And it's a work that, I mean, all my books are like my children. That one is near and dear to my heart because that was how my career started. I'll tell a quick story if it's okay. When I
Sure.
was my very first internship as a social worker, I was at an adolescent partial care program, and it was kids aged 13 to 18. They come after school, a whole host of presenting issues, depression, suicidality, et cetera, et cetera. And the supervisor said, well, all the interns have to run a therapy group. And I was like, I don't know how to do that. What's that? Like, what do I even do? And she said, well, pick something that, you feel you find interesting, and think about how it might benefit the teens in the program. So I thought, well, I'll do narrative therapy. And the kid, they just loved it. They just loved this narrative therapy group. It gave them this opportunity to tell their story, and it was a closed group. So we had the same members every week when we met. It was this sense of safety, of confidentiality. So anyway, that book is very near to my heart because that was formulaic in my journey into becoming a psychotherapist.
It's a very interesting approach. I definitely recommend people looking through it for if you're looking for a different way to talk about yourself. I mean, to think about how you always define yourself, like, I work at the library, but if you have something that is skewing your um perspective, and a detriment to your self-esteem, it really offers um, a lot of different devices and practices um, to go through that I found very interesting and thoughtful. So just definitely wanted to mention that.
Thanks for the plug.
No problem. So going along with, let's talk a little bit about advice for family and friends because often people most affected by anxiety are the ones standing next to the person experiencing it. And so what are two or three specific things a supportive observer can do or say, perhaps what they should avoid, to help de-escalate a situation without making the person feel managed or judged?
I'll tell you what not to say. Don't say you're fine. Don't say calm down. Don't try not to give these very simplistic directives. Try to take a little bit more of a curious approach, an approach of, we call it in therapy, holding space for the other person. So just be in that space with them, give them the reassurance that they need, but try not to rush them out of it. I think we have a natural tendency to want to do that when somebody's uncomfortable. We want to rush them out of that feeling, but panic will take its course. You don't really need to do much aside from just be with that person. And you also have to be attuned to what that person needs. Everybody needs something different when they're struggling, right? And so the books offer general guidance that can be helpful to a lot of people. What you need might be different from what I need. When I'm going through these moments, it's hard for me to actually find words. So I often need somebody to just be present with me. I don't necessarily need a conversation. I don't necessarily need a pep talk. I kind of just need to know I'm safe. So I think trying not to give directives about what to do, and also just being present and holding space with the other person. Being an advocate. There are sometimes, for instance, people who are going through severe depression or panic and are finding it difficult to look for resources on their own behalf. And I get calls sometimes in my practice from, hey, my spouse is struggling, or this person in my life is struggling, and that's okay. You absolutely can do that. So be an advocate for that loved one. Understand that these issues, as I mentioned before, can be really isolating. They can be debilitating to some extent, and so advocating for our loved ones is really important, and it's just a way to show our love and our care.
Absolutely. Nothing better than to be a pillar for a loved one, just to be someone to lean on. Um, I was thinking, just sort of relating it to pop culture. I'm just sort of going on a tangent here. My husband and I often talk about how a lot of TV and movies portray panic attacks these days. I find that it comes up often that there is a character who suffers from this, and just curious what your take is on um, how it's portrayed, and if you think there is anyone that really gets it right. I was actually just watching, I don't know if I'm allowed to say Ted Lasso today. He suffers from some panic
Yeah,
attacks, and
yeah,
his response is a flight. He's just out of there.
yep.
Um, and just curious your analysis of what pop culture
Mm.
has portrayed, and if maybe we can talk about resources too, how people, what are the next steps for, you've gone through this, where are you going to go to, um, if you're ready to um, work it out?
Right. Well, the culture question is really interesting, and I'll have to be honest. I have a toddler at home, so I can't say I watch a lot of television at the moment. I mean, I do, but it's mainly Baby Shark and Blippi and those
Yeah,
wonderful things. But I'll tell you what came to my mind really is The Sopranos. Dating myself a little bit, but so Tony Soprano, this tough guy mobster, would have these panic attacks, and the way they were portrayed, I felt was actually quite accurate. He would get dizzy, this room spinning dizziness, and like almost like he was overcome and he just didn't know how to get out of it. And Ted Lasso, I did see the first season, and I don't remember if there were panic attacks in that season, but I know he was, going to I guess the team psychologist and beginning to talk through some issues. So, but I think, look, the larger thing is that, again, it's further normalization. Even the series Shrinking, right, is all about a therapist and it's about a therapy practice. So I think this becoming more mainstream is very important and helpful. As far as the portrayal of panic attacks, they're likely going to get aspects of it right, no matter what show it is. But again, a panic attack is extremely unique to the individual, just to how your body uniquely responds to that stressful stimulus. Um, and if there's any of these series that are making them glamorous, they're anything but glamorous. They're not enjoyable to experience. But again, the normalization is, I think, helpful. Um, what was the second part of the question? Oh, resources.
Um, Resources, yeah. Mm.
Yeah, resources, there's so many within our communities because panic and illness anxiety, although uncomfortable, are not necessarily acute issues. They're not necessarily emergent issues. There are so many therapists available in our community. There's a lot of therapists. I know just in the office complex I work in, I'm surrounded by other clinicians. So there's a lot of us out there. There's a lot of resources. Psychology Today online database is a great resource. You can whittle down by area, by even by gender, by specialty. There's a lot of filters that can be used. You can filter by clinicians who take insurance versus clinicians who don't. There's a lot of resources to be found online. I'm not talking about going to Chat or Claude or Copilot for any of this. I'm talking more about finding those of us who are credentialed and who can offer therapy sessions. But that would be just like for me. It took me a while to get there, but I was so happy when I started to go to therapy. I'm not trying to sell psychotherapy. I'm just saying that it's a resource that's out there. Other resources. Self-care is a huge resource. So we live in such a beautiful area. If you can, be outside on a beautiful day. Don't underestimate the value and the benefit of some of those things that we can do for ourselves. Creating boundaries with social media, creating boundaries with devices. There's this movement now towards analog hobbies. These things that we can do, like gardening, like reading crossword puzzles and Sudoku and model railroading and things that are taking us offline and that are not digitized. All of those are resources that are at our fingertips. And think about the nervous system. What those activities help us do is to calm the nervous system. When we are scrolling, particularly if we're scrolling, whether it's violent scenes or just, constant news stream, that's really going to have an effect on the nervous system. If you're out there weeding, that's going to have a different effect on your nervous system. So that's, resources. Yeah, there's plenty in the community. There's obviously resources like people like me who write these books, but there's also resources that you can employ just in your daily life.
Absolutely. I mean, this past weekend, there were about 10 different spring festivals in beautiful locations celebrating,
Yeah,
Mother Nature. So,
right.
those are always, um, I mean, while the crowds may not be the best, the intent and the draw that is there.
But don't underestimate even just taking a short walk. If you live in a peaceful neighborhood, going for a walk, there are so many things we can do that do not cause us to incur any financial or geographical inconvenience.
Great. Yeah, exactly. Our audience has been very quiet, so I just want to remind them that they are welcome to chime in with questions in the Q&A. If you have any comments, you can put them in the chat. Um, I'm glad everyone is listening intently, but we are here to answer any questions or take any comments that you have. Phil has generously donated his time, but I will go on with my questions as well. And so I'm gonna maybe go sort of connect your book with your overall perspective. And so since your books have been out, what's the most surprising or moving feedback you've received from a reader? Has any reader's perspective ever changed how you approach these topics in your practice? I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about that.
I've been amazed at how many people will reach out, and I don't, and I didn't expect. I thought I don't know if anybody's ever going to read these books. Like honestly, I had very very low expectations. But I've gotten reviews on the books on on Amazon or Barnes and Noble that have been wonderful, and talk about how helpful the books have been. I've gotten contacts from somebody contacted me from China and said I've been working through illness anxiety, and I happened to come upon your book, was in one of the libraries there somehow, and I mean that's incredible. There hasn't been any single piece of feedback. It's just any feedback I get is just a wonderful feeling of, you've put something out there that there are people are finding it helpful, which is, just amazing. I mean, that's more that's more meaningful than any royalty could ever be, truly.
Absolutely, knowing that you've been able to touch and educate someone as far as China, from here, that's very cool.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in the chat, we have a question. Any opinions about diet and gut health and any correlation with anxiety?
I'm not an expert on that, but I will tell you that I'm certainly aware that that is strongly in the psychological literature nowadays. There is a plethora of research connecting gut health, diet to anxiety. So I suspect that there is a correlation there. I don't want to speak out of school, so I don't want to give recommendations that I'm not qualified to give, but I think that there likely is a connection, and I would encourage you to just to do more research on it from vetted sources, of course, sources that are evidence based and are based in scientific research and psychological research. But I think that the things we do in our daily functioning in our daily lives directly impact how much anxiety we experience and how we cope with that anxiety. So I would say that there most likely is a correlation there, but I don't want to speak on something that's not my specialty.
Good, good. Thank you for that. Um, Again, we welcome people to include any questions they have. I will continue with what I have, though, for some questions. Um, I mean, I still have a lot to talk about in terms of books. Uh, is there a chapter in the book that was particularly difficult to write?
Wow. There were parts in all of the books that were challenging to write because we have as therapists, there's this concept called countertransference, and maybe some of you have heard of it. And what it means is that, we might be sitting with a client and the client is sharing something and it's hitting our stuff. It's tapping into something we've been through, and it starts to make us feel uncomfortable as therapists. And I think I went through some moments of that in writing these books because I was being vulnerable about some of the things I'd been through. And in the panic attack book, I give these little clinical vignettes, and every now and then, I have these made up names, like this is the vignette of Charles, this is whoever, but every now and then it's Phil, and that's actually me. It's actually something that happened to me. So some of those were not super comfortable, but I felt very necessary. In my continued effort towards normalization. So I think the places in the books where I was tapping into my own experiences, my own discomfort. In the illness anxiety book, I talk about times when I had gone to the emergency room in a panic to find, to sometimes be shamed, honestly, to be told like, "What are you doing here?" So to write about those was to remember those moments, and that wasn't the most comfortable thing. But again, I felt necessary to the overall message of the books.
Right. And you do share like you were saying, a fair number of case studies,
Yeah.
which I think is so helpful because part of, relating to another person's experience is what helps validate yourself, right? I mean,
Right. Right. And those case studies are typically, at least the way I do them, they're patchwork. They're not drawn from one particular client. They're often a couple different experiences, obviously de-identified and made so that there's no connection could ever be made. But they don't come, my point is they weren't created in a vacuum. They come from actual things that happen to actual people, which is in the psychology and self-improvement books I've read. I've always found those to be very helpful towards the normalization and just the understanding that people do go through these issues.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's see. So if someone has read, like you were saying, there are plenty of self-help books out there. So if you're reading, you're at the place where you're seeking some help and you're reading the self-help books. But what if someone still feels stuck? How do you know how do they know when it's time to bridge the gap and seek professional therapeutic support?
That's a great question. I'll answer that kind of in two parts. First of all, if you were to seek psychological help through a therapist like myself, for instance, you're under no obligation, and most therapists, I think, will offer to consult with you ahead of ever scheduling anything to chat with you. So even if you're on the fence, but you're thinking this might be helpful, I would encourage you to reach out. Our field is very much predicated on wanting to be helpful. We yes, there is a business component to it, but that's not our main focus. I would say that it's something to explore, even if you're kind of like, I don't know about this. I've many times consulted with somebody just for 10 or 15 minutes who said, come stop by my office. We'll sit and chat for a few minutes and see if I can be helpful. We'll go from there. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it, I'll draw from my own experience. Um, you know, I let myself get to a place of I don't know what else to do. So I have to go to therapy now. And what I would love is for other people to not have to get to that moment. So I think trust yourself, take your own temperature, so to speak. You know when you're having a tough time. Your body gives you cues, your emotions give you cues. If you're overly stressed, you're burned out, you probably know that you are, and you need to trust that. So there's no exact moment where you pinpoint, okay, this is I need to go do more. You just need to trust yourself to do that. Now, since I started my own therapy about 20 years ago, I've gone faithfully, couple layoffs here and there, but I continue to go. And there's nothing acute happening. There's nothing, horribly terrible going on, but it's great for me to maintain my baseline. So understand too that reaching out for help through therapy does not have to be because there's a crisis happening.
Right. That's an excellent distinction, because a person in a crisis isn't always able to talk through it, and
Yeah. And that's how, by the sorry to interrupt, but that's how we
no.
end up, particularly with illness, anxiety, and panic. That's how a lot of us end up in the ER because we're at this crisis point. We haven't been maintaining, we haven't been going to something to help us understand this. And so we don't know what else to do. I'd had, I don't think I'm exaggerating here. I think I'd had 6 or 7 ER visits that turned out to be panic where I finally was like, you know what, like I think I gotta go the therapy route. And I explored the medication route as well. And of course, these are personal. This is what you are comfortable with. There's no exact recipe. They were helpful to me. But again, it took me a long time and in retrospect, longer than I would have liked to have gotten there. So you're right, in that crisis moment, you're thinking crisis response. And our just this is just nationwide, the way we handle mental health crises in this country is less than ideal. ERs are not equipped to handle this. People who go to the ER for mental health issues often do not have a good experience. In the worst case, it can be traumatizing. So it's important to try to preempt some of those things from happening. And I bring that up only because that can be something that occurs with both illness anxiety and with panic attacks.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you for answering that. Um, so, all right. So we were just talking about the crisis. And so for daily habits, let's talk about low stakes daily habits that can keep a person's baseline anxiety from creeping up into the danger zone. Do you have any recommendations that you can
I
offer?
have so many recommendations for that. And some of them are going to sound really overly simplistic, but I want you to trust me. They're very important. I'm going to start with a really big one, hydration. And I'll share an anecdote. The very first panic attack I ever had occurred when I was driving, and it was very scary. I went to the emergency room, and I'd been there for a while, and the doctor eventually said, "So, what have you had to eat today?" And I said, "Nothing." And he said, "What have you had to drink today?" And I said, "Coffee." And it was kind of like this moment of like, and I forget what his response was many years ago, but it was kind of like, right, right. Should probably drink water. I should probably eat something. So again, sounds simplistic. I'm saying it kind of tongue in cheek, but it's really important. I believe looking back that if I had been hydrated and if I had eaten breakfast, which is not something I did at the time, but I now do every single day. But that if I had done those things, I might not have experienced that panic attack. So the daily habits are small habits that make a very big difference. When you are dehydrated, when you have not eaten, you are more prone to lightheadedness. You're more prone to feeling off balance. Feeling off balance can, some of these things can trigger panic because you start to worry, why am I off balance? And now the loop begins, that anxiety loop. Well, wait, what's happening? What's happening? Maybe the what if. What if I'm having an aneurysm? What if I'm having a heart attack? Well, maybe I need to go to the hospital. Maybe I shouldn't be driving. You can hear how this can all spiral. Crazy to
Mhm.
think that it could be avoided by having had some water and some breakfast that morning. So start with very simplistic things. I'm a big believer in just having some time that is unstimulated. We are so used to having constant stimulation. So I think, making an effort, even for 5 or 10 minutes, to just be away from your device can be helpful. To sit. People are scared of meditation because it sounds so difficult, but you can meditate. As you're listening to me, you can meditate. You do not have to have formal meditation practice. So I think taking some time to just be still, to be quiet, to allow your nervous system to regulate itself can be really important. So hydration, diet, um, time away from stimulation, boundaries. We hear that word a lot in just the psycho babble of the day. But what that really means as far as panic and anxiety goes is compartments in our lives. If we are always working, if we're answering emails at 2 o'clock in the morning, if we're thinking about work and we're lying in bed, we are opening the door to panic and anxiety. We're opening the door to rumination and fixation. So I think simple concepts like I'm done with work for the day. I close my laptop, and that means I don't do any more work is really, really important. Physical exercise, but again, it can be whatever suits you. It does the same way meditation doesn't have to be a formal practice. Physical exercise doesn't have to be a gym membership. It can be taking a
Mhm.
short walk. Okay. It can be walking the dog. I think that part of what creates an obstacle at times is thinking too big about some of these things. Like a self-care day. Well, that means I have to go spend $500 at the spa. Not at all. A self-care day could be curling up on the couch with a cup of tea and a good book, right? So these daily habits are these small things, and we can look at them as they're gifts to ourselves and they're gifts to our future selves. And we also have to be okay with imperfection because we're not always going to get it right and we're not always going to do it and we're not always going to make the best choices for ourselves. We're not always going to make the best dietary choices. We're not always going to get exercise. We're not always going to hydrate enough. But that's how we fight that shame factor is we have an intention to do so, but that we forgive ourselves if we don't. I hope that answers the question.
That I think that was beautiful. It was a good start with nourishment and boundaries. I think those hit some strong chords. Um, so that's great. Thank you. Let's see. How are we doing on time? We have about 10 minutes left. So if anyone else would like to chime in, I have just a couple more questions for you, Phil. Um, so let's see. Well, we've been talking about how you share your personal experiences and that you've been revisiting them, within the books um, and in our conversation now. So has your own relationship with anxiety changed since you started teaching others how to navigate it?
Yeah. Yeah, big time. I'm not I'm not really afraid of my anxiety anymore. And I was for a time. I felt that it could control me and it had a lot of power over me. And I still take it seriously because it can flare up at times and it can spike and I can have those feelings again, but I feel much more able to manage it. So I think my relationship with it is much more balanced than it once was. I'm much more equipped to be able to understand when it's happening, to know what will help me in those moments, to not beat myself up if I have an anxious day. I'll say that to myself sometimes. You're having an anxious day today. And it actually soothes me to just acknowledge that and to know that. If I have an anxious day, I can still work. I can still see my clients and do a good job. I can still be present with my family. I can still carry out my daily obligations. So, my relationship has changed quite a bit. I've learned a lot from the folks I've worked with as clients, who've been kind enough to trust me with what they're going through. And they've all been case studies in resilience in being able to cope with this issue and heal from it. So really, and that's one of the beautiful things about psychotherapy is it's a two-way street. Sometimes we're looked at as the clinical expert, but we learn quite a bit from the people who sit across from us.
Excellent. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. In the chat, someone is asking, how does anxiety carry over to sleep and dreams?
Excellent question. Well, it carries over to sleep by disturbing it. That's for sure. So if we're holding on to a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress during the day, it is likely going to affect our ability to get restful sleep. People who are experiencing anxiety, and certainly on anxious days for me, I might wake up 3, 4 times during the night. Because I'm so unsettled. My nervous system is off kilter, it's off balance. Other things that happen during sleep that are because of anxiety are things like grinding your teeth. So there can even be, these other physical issues that can arise. The reality is that anxiety, if we don't cope with it in an adaptive way, it's going to stick to us. And it doesn't matter if we're sleeping, it's still going to be there. As far as dreams go, dreams, there's a lot of schools of thought psychologically on dreams. I don't think there's any exact understanding of how dreams work, but I'll give you my perspective on it is that our dreams are the unprocessed parts of our consciousness. The things that we are still holding on to in our conscious life come up in our unconscious life. So if we're really, really stressed about something and it's we haven't really been able to cope with it, we haven't really been able to process it, it might pop up in a dream because it's still in there. It's rattling around in there. So I guess the short answer is anxiety certainly has an impact on sleep. That I can say with certainty, and most likely on dreams.
Great. Thank you. Um, so so just to wrap up a little bit, uh, we talked about it a little bit, but for someone who's attending today and who feels like they're ready to take the next step, what's the best way to vet the local resources or therapists to ensure they find a good fit for their specific needs?
Well, like I said, please have a consult with a potential therapist. Most should offer that. It's good practice, if you ask me. So again, don't feel that don't feel that you're insulting anybody. If you were to say, "I just want to get to know you a little bit," and we'll go from there. I would really recommend that. For me, from the clinical side, that's really important because I don't want to blindly take on a client. What if I'm not the right fit? What if I can't help that person? So it's very important for me to be able to do that. So that's a piece of advice that I would absolutely give. I can't guarantee that all therapists offer that, but I know most of those that I know do. It's really become a normal part of our practice. Also, try not to be overwhelmed by how many names are out there. There are a lot of names. There's a lot of folks out there, but that's a good thing. It means that there's a lot of potential providers who can help you. Again, use some of those databases like Psychology Today's database. There are others as well. And then just a cautionary note I would give, there's a difference between a therapist in your community and a therapist through a larger platform like Headway or BetterHelp. And I'm not saying there's anything bad about those therapists, but that may not be somebody local to you. That may be somebody who practices in a different state or across the country. So you have to decide if you're comfortable with that. The other thing I would recommend is deciding if using your insurance is important to you, and if so, searching for therapists who take your insurance. Some do. There's a lot that don't, and the reason for that is that insurance can be a bit of a maze. But we are out there, those of us who do accept insurance.
Great. Thank you. The Psychology Today website is very easy to
Yeah,
use. Um, I've used it to help people out before, and like you said, there's a million filters in there, and you can even sort it by distance if you want to. You may find someone who's within walking distance from your house. You never know,
right.
which
Yeah.
can be an important part when, making those steps are difficult when you're going through something. Still a lot to consider, but the information is out there. Um, so just a comment saying thank you for sharing your personal experiences and your time. Thank you
My
for,
pleasure. Yeah, it's my
yeah.
pleasure.
Um, just want to take a moment, see if anyone else has any questions. I've pretty much wrapped up everything on my list. Is there anything else you would like to add, Phil?
Just a thank you. I appreciate everybody, coming to listen to me. That's very flattering, and just so great to be able to give something back to the library. The local library has always been an important part of my life, so it's really a pleasure to be able to help out in the community. So yeah, thank you everybody. And if you're going through illness, anxiety, panic, please know that there is hope, there is healing. We do heal from these things. We are resilient, and you're not alone. That's always my message, and I'm not just saying that. I know that. So please, I hope you know that.
Absolutely. And if anyone's interested, I'm just putting the form again to put your information in to get a copy of each of Phil's books. We'll be notifying the lucky person via email. Phil, I want to thank you so much for donating your time to this
Yeah.
program. I hope this conversation has opened everyone's minds and deepened their understanding how to approach panic and illness anxiety with care. I also want to thank our participants for being a part of this conversation. And I will just quickly put Phil's website in the chat as well, just for any resources that he has on there. Like he said, he's a member of our community here in Pennington and can't thank you enough.
Thank you so much. Thanks again, everybody.
Yeah, it was a great conversation. Everyone have a wonderful night. Okay, thank you. Take care.